I work at a small local bank, the kind where everyone knows each other. Every year, our manager arranges a Christmas retreat to a remote cabin in the woods. It's meant to build camaraderie, but honestly, it's just a forced social event for most of us. This year, we rented a large cabin in the middle of the Adirondacks. It was supposed to be cozy, but the idea of being isolated with coworkers I barely tolerated didn't thrill me. Still, I went, partly out of obligation, partly because I didn't want to seem like a killjoy. We arrived on the afternoon of December 22nd, 2023. There were 10 of us in total, including our manager, Janet. She had chosen a cabin miles away from the nearest town. The roads were winding and covered in snow, and it took nearly 2 hours to reach the place after we left the main highway. The cabin was big, with 3 floors and more rooms than we needed. It had a rustic charm, but it felt off somehow. The windows were large and let in a lot of light, but the way the shadows stretched across the walls as the sun began to set gave me an uneasy feeling. I chalked it up to the long drive and told myself I was overthinking. The first evening was uneventful. We settled in, unpacked, and gathered around the fireplace in the living room. Janet had brought plenty of food and drinks, and the mood was light. Everyone laughed and chatted, and for a moment, I forgot about my unease. The fireplace crackled warmly, and the smell of burning would mix with the scent of hot cocoa and spiced cider. But later that night, things started to feel strange. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got after everyone went to bed. In the city, there's always some background noise, cars, distant voices, something. Here, there was nothing but the sound of the wind against the cabin. It was so quiet that every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified. I lay in my room on the second floor, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate. At first, I thought it was one of my coworkers heading to the bathroom, but the steps didn't stop. They moved back and forth, pausing occasionally, as if whoever it was listening for something. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more. The steps stopped outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for the door to open, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, the steps moved away, fading into the distance. I told myself it was just one of my coworkers being restless and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I mentioned the footsteps to a few people over breakfast. Most of them laughed it off, saying it was probably the old cabin settling. Janet, ever the optimist, suggested we do a group hike to shake off any cabin fever. I reluctantly agreed. The trail Janet picked wasn't particularly challenging, but it was steep in some areas. The snow made it slippery, and I couldn't help but notice how quiet the forest was. No birds, no animals, just the sound of our boots crunching through the snow. It was unnerving. About an hour into the hike, we found a clearing with an old, rusted pickup truck. It was abandoned, covered in snow, and had no license plates. Janet thought it was a fun photo op and made everyone pose with it. I stayed back, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. Something about the truck felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. When we got back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see someone standing in the tree line. But there was nothing. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, heavier. I wasn't the only one who heard them. One of my coworkers, Brian, came downstairs to check it out. He thought it was Janet playing a prank, but when he opened the front door to see if anyone was outside, he froze. The snow outside the cabin was undisturbed.
No footprints.
Nothing. Brian closed the door quickly, muttering something about the wind. But we all knew that didn't make sense. The third day, December 24th, was when things started to spiral. We woke up to find the power out. Janet said it was probably the snowstorm that had rolled in overnight and assured us the generator would kick in. But it didn't. We tried our phones, but there was no signal. Janet had a satellite phone for emergencies, but when she went to get it, it was gone. She swore she'd left it in the kitchen, but it wasn't there. We spent the day bundled up in layers, trying to keep warm. The fireplace was our only source of heat, and we rationed the wood carefully. As the day dragged on, the unease grew. Every noise outside the cabin felt amplified. Every shadow seemed darker. That night, we decided to stick together in the living room. No one wanted to be alone. We pushed the couches close to the fireplace and huddled together. The wind outside howled, and the cabin creaked under the weight of the storm. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of a loud bang. It came from the kitchen. My heart raced as I sat up, scanning the room. Everyone else was still asleep, their faces pale in the dim firelight. I got up slowly, my breath visible in the freezing air. The kitchen was dark, but as I stepped closer, I saw that the back door was wide open. Snow had blown in, covering the floor. I closed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. When I turned around, I saw something in the snow, a set of footprints leading away from the cabin. They weren't ours. I woke Janet and the others, showing them the footprints. Panic set in as we realized someone had been inside the cabin. We checked every room, every corner, but no one was there. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and whispered plans. We decided to leave at first light, but when morning came, we found the cars wouldn't start. The engines were dead, and the tires had been slashed. We were stranded. Janet tried to keep everyone calm, but it was clear she was just as scared as the rest of us. We decided to wait out the storm, hoping someone would come looking for us. By Christmas morning, supplies were running low. The storm had eased, but the sense of dread remained. We stayed close to the fireplace, listening for any sound outside. Around noon, we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the tree line. At first, we thought it was an animal, but as it got closer, we realized it wasn't. It sounded human. We never saw who or what made the sound, but by the time rescue teams found us 3 days later, we were barely hanging on. They said we were lucky to be alive. I'm not so sure. I still see those footprints in my nightmares. It was the winter of 2016, and we had planned a trip to a cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. My brother-in-law, Josh, had recently married his wife, Laura, and they invited me along to get out of the city for a few days. I had nothing else going on, and the idea of quiet days surrounded by snowy pines sounded perfect. Josh had found this place online, a small, off-grid cabin tucked away from everything. It sounded cozy, peaceful, and just what I needed. We left early on a Friday morning. The drive was long, almost 6 hours, but the further we got from the city, the more excited I felt. Snow covered everything, and the dense forest lining the winding roads seemed untouched, like something from a postcard. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows over the cabin. The place was rustic but charming. It had a pitched roof, a small porch, and a woodpile stacked neatly against one wall. Inside, there was a wood-burning stove, a couple of worn couches, and a tiny kitchen. The only bedroom was upstairs in a loft, so I planned to crash on the couch. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and the nearest town was a good 30 miles away. It felt like we were completely alone out there. That first night was uneventful. We ate dinner, played some board games, and sat by the fire talking. The wind howled outside, but the cabin was warm and snug. I fell asleep quickly, thinking how nice it was to be away from the noise and chaos of city life. The next morning, Josh and Laura wanted to explore the area. There was a trail behind the cabin that supposedly led to a frozen lake about 2 miles away. I decided to stay back, figuring I'd enjoy the quiet and maybe read a book. Before they left, Josh showed me where the extra firewood was and told me to keep the stove going. Once they were gone, the cabin felt eerily quiet. I stoked the fire, made myself some coffee, and settled into one of the couches with a paperback I'd brought along. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. But as the morning wore on, I started noticing other sounds. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing against the trees, but this was different. It sounded like faint footsteps crunching through the snow, moving around the cabin. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. I walked over to the window and peered outside. The snow was untouched except for the trail Josh and Laura had made when they left. There was nothing out there. Still, the sound persisted, faint and irregular, like someone or something was circling the cabin. By noon, Josh and Laura still hadn't returned. I wasn't worried yet. They'd said they might spend some time at the lake, but the strange sounds outside were getting harder to ignore. I decided to step outside and take a look around. The air was bitterly cold, and the snow crunched loudly under my boots as I walked around the cabin. I didn't see any tracks or signs of movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees stood tall and silent, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. I quickly went back inside, bolting the door behind me. By late afternoon, I was starting to get uneasy. It wasn't like Josh to be gone this long without checking in. I knew they didn't have cell service, but they had promised to be back by lunch. I tried to focus on keeping the fire going and staying calm, but the quiet cabin was beginning to feel oppressive. As the sun set, plunging the forest into darkness, I realized I hadn't heard those strange footsteps since earlier that afternoon. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Hours passed, and there was still no sign of Josh and Laura. I lit a couple of candles to supplement the dim light from the fire and tried to read again, but I couldn't focus. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. Then, just after midnight, I heard it again, those faint, crunching footsteps in the snow. This time, they were closer, just outside the cabin. My stomach knotted, and I froze, straining to hear. The sound moved slowly, deliberate and measured, circling the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, keeping low. Shining the beam outside, I scanned the snow but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew I was watching. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going and stayed huddled on the couch, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. By dawn, the footsteps had stopped, and the cabin was deathly quiet again. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I decided to go look for Josh and Laura. I bundled up, grabbed a map Josh had left on the table, and headed out the back door. The trail to the lake was easy to follow, but I was on edge, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I reached the lake, my heart sank. Their footprints led out onto the ice, but they didn't come back. The snow was disturbed in a wide area near the center of the lake, as if there had been a struggle. But there were no signs of Josh or Laura. I ran back to the cabin, panic setting in. Grabbing the emergency radio Josh had brought along, I called for help. It took hours for the sheriff's department to arrive, and by the time they did, the snow had started falling again, covering the tracks on the lake. The search went on for days, but they never found Josh or Laura. The official report said they must have fallen through the ice, but I wasn't convinced. Something about the disturbed snow on the lake didn't add up. To this day, I can't explain what happened that weekend. I moved away from Michigan not long after, but every winter, when the snow starts falling, I think about that cabin and those footsteps in the snow. Whatever was out there that night, I hope I never encounter it again. My name is Alex, and this happened back in 2015 when I was 28. I'm a nurse, and at the time I was working long, grueling shifts at a hospital in upstate New York. To say I needed a break would be an understatement. When my supervisor approved a week off, I couldn't pack fast enough. My plan was simple: find a secluded cabin, disconnect from the chaos, and let the quiet reset my mind. I rented a small cabin in the Adirondacks, about 20 miles away from the nearest town. It was nestled deep in the woods, just a few hundred feet from a serene lake. It sounded perfect. No phones ringing, no beeping monitors, just me, the trees, and my thoughts. I arrived on a crisp October morning. The air smelled like pine and earth, and golden leaves carpeted the ground. The cabin was rustic but cozy, exactly what I'd imagined. It had a small living area, a kitchenette, one bedroom, and a bathroom. A wood stove provided heat, and the owner had left a pile of logs stacked neatly by the door. For the first 2 days, everything was perfect. I spent my mornings kayaking on the lake and my afternoons hiking the nearby trails. At night, I'd read by the wood stove, the crackling fire the only sound in the stillness. I'd never felt so at peace, but on the third night, things began to feel off. I was sitting on the couch, lost in a novel, when I heard it, a loud thud from outside. It wasn't the kind of sound you could brush off as a falling branch or an animal. It was heavy, deliberate. I froze, my book forgotten, and strained to listen. Nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. Maybe a deer had bumped into the side of the cabin. I tried to return to my book, but my focus was gone. When I went to bed, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The silence, which had been so comforting before, now felt oppressive. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race. I eventually fell into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by a noise I couldn't immediately identify. It was faint but persistent, like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. I sat up, every nerve in my body on high alert. The sound was coming from outside, near the lake. Grabbing my flashlight, I crept to the window. The beam of light barely penetrated the darkness, but I could make out the faint shimmer of the lake through the trees. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the sound continued. I told myself it was probably an animal, a bear, maybe dragging something it had scavenged. But even as I tried to convince myself, my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, I decided to investigate. The daylight gave me courage, and I was determined to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation. I walked down to the lake, my boots crunching on the frosty ground. The air was still, and the water looked like glass, reflecting the gray sky. Near the shoreline, I saw it, a large patch of disturbed earth. It looked like something heavy had been dragged from the water into the woods. My stomach turned. The marks were too wide to be from an animal. It looked like someone had dragged a tarp or a large bag. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I followed the trail into the woods, my breath fogging in the cold air. The disturbed earth led deeper into the forest, winding between the trees. After about 20 yards, the trail ended abruptly in a small clearing. The ground was covered in leaves, and I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. But as I stood there, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like I was being watched. I quickly retreated to the cabin, locking the door behind me. My plan was to pack up and leave as soon as possible, but as I was throwing my things into my bag, I caught sight of something through the window. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, and they led from the woods to the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. Someone had been watching me. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Who was out there? Why were they watching me? I decided to wait until morning to leave. Driving the narrow, unlit road at night wasn't an option, especially not in my panicked state. I double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, then sat on the couch with a kitchen knife in my hand. The night stretched on endlessly. Every noise made me jump, and I barely blinked, my eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the dragging sound. This time, it was closer. I turned off the lights and peeked out the window. The beam of my flashlight revealed a figure standing at the edge of the woods. They were holding something, a long, heavy object wrapped in a tarp. My heart pounded as I realized they were dragging it toward the cabin. I ducked out of sight and crawled to the bedroom, my mind racing. I locked the door and shoved the dresser in front of it. Then I crouched in the corner, clutching the knife, and waited. Somehow, I must have dozed off, because I woke to sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought I dreamed the whole thing. But then I saw the footprints, fresh and unmistakable, leading to the front door. I didn't waste any time. I threw my things into the car and sped down the dirt road, my heart racing the entire way. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a diner and called the cabin's owner. I told him everything, but he seemed more annoyed than concerned. He said he'd check it out and hung up. I didn't stay to find out what he discovered. I drove straight home and never looked back. A few weeks later, I saw a news story about a missing person in the area near the cabin. They'd been last seen hiking near the lake. The report mentioned that search teams had found signs of a struggle but no body. I couldn't help but wonder if the figure I saw that night had something to do with it. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but I've never gone back to the woods, and I never will. I wasn't expecting much from the cabin when I first moved in. It was 1998 and I was fresh out of college. The world felt like it was at my feet, and I wanted solitude to figure out my next steps. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, tucked away in the forests of Montana. I found it on a classified ad, a dirt cheap rental owned by an older man who seemed eager to get it off his hands. The cabin itself was modest. A small living room, a kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom. It had seen better days, but it was enough for me. What drew me in was the seclusion. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the dirt road. I liked that. I wasn't looking for company. The neighbor, as I'd later learn, was a man named Henry Willis. He was in his 60s, tall and wiry, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. I'd heard from the locals in town that he was a retired cop. He'd been living in his cabin for decades, long after his wife passed away. People described him as quiet but friendly, though no one seemed to know him well. I didn't meet him right away. For the first couple of weeks, I kept to myself. My days were spent reading, hiking, and enjoying the peace that came with being so far removed from civilization. At night, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets, owls, and the occasional rustling of leaves that I tried to convince myself was just the wind. It wasn't until I started noticing small, odd things around the property that I met Henry. The first thing I noticed was the feeling of being watched. It started one evening while I was sitting on the porch, sipping coffee and enjoying the sunset. The forest was dense, with tall pines that cast long shadows across the clearing. It should have felt peaceful, but something felt off. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the feeling persisted. Then there were the footprints. One morning, I stepped outside to find a trail of muddy footprints leading from the forest to the edge of my property. They were large, too large to be mine, and they didn't match any shoes I owned. I followed them as far as I could, but they disappeared into the underbrush. Then there was the tapping. Late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I'd hear a soft tap 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 on the windows. It wasn't the branches of trees. There weren't any close enough to the cabin. It sounded deliberate, like someone was testing the glass. I started locking all the doors and windows religiously, though I doubted it would do much good if someone really wanted to get in. A few days later, I finally met Henry. I was walking down the dirt road to pick up my mail when I saw him standing by his mailbox. He nodded as I approached, and though I'd been planning to just pass by, something about his presence made me stop. We didn't exchange many words, just pleasantries. But there was something in his demeanor that stuck with me. His eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the surroundings, like he was always on alert. Over the next few weeks, I saw him occasionally, always outside, always watchful. I got the sense that he didn't sleep much, and I started wondering what kind of life he'd led as a cop. The strange occurrences didn't stop. One night, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing just outside my bedroom window. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. The breathing was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. It lasted for what felt like an eternity before fading away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the wooden frame of the window. They were fresh, jagged, and unmistakably made by human fingernails. I decided to tell Henry. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because he was the only person nearby, and his background as a cop made me feel like he'd know what to do. When I told him about the scratches and the breathing, he didn't seem surprised. Instead, he asked me if I'd noticed anything else. I mentioned the footprints, the tapping, and the feeling of being watched. He nodded, his expression grim. "You're not the first," he finally said. Henry explained that over the years, several people who had rented the cabin before me had reported similar experiences. Some had lasted only a few days before leaving, while others had tried to stick it out, only to leave abruptly without giving a reason. Henry didn't have any concrete answers, but he had suspicions. He said there were rumors of an ex-convict who'd lived in the area decades ago, someone who'd disappeared after a string of violent crimes. The locals believed he'd died in the woods, but Henry wasn't so sure. He told me to stay alert and keep my doors locked. If anything else happened, I should let him know immediately. A week later, I reached my breaking point. It was just after midnight, and I was lying in bed when I heard the sound of footsteps on the porch. They were heavy and deliberate, the kind of steps someone takes when they want you to know they're there. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd started keeping by my bed and crept to the living room. The footsteps continued, moving slowly around the cabin. Then the doorknob rattled. I froze, my grip tightening on the bat. The rattling grew more forceful, and then there was a loud, deliberate knock. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After what felt like hours, the knocking stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, I found a single muddy footprint on the porch. A bare foot, large and misshapen, with long, jagged toenails. The next day, I told Henry everything. He listened carefully, his expression unreadable. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "We need to find him before he finds you." Henry had a small arsenal of weapons, remnants of his years on the force. He armed himself with a shotgun and handed me a pistol, though I had no idea how to use it. Together, we set out into the woods, following the trail of footprints. The search lasted hours. The woods were eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you and makes every sound seem deafening. Finally, we found it, a makeshift campsite deep in the forest. It was crude, a tarp stretched between trees, a fire pit filled with ashes. But what caught my attention was the collection of items scattered around. There were knives, ropes, and tattered clothing. And then there were the photographs. Dozens of them, all taken through windows, all of me. Henry's face darkened as he examined the campsite. "We're not dealing with a ghost," he said. "This is a man, and he's been watching you for a long time. We didn't find him that day." Henry reported everything to the local authorities, who promised to investigate, but I knew better than to expect results. I moved out of the cabin the next morning. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw movement in the trees. A shadowy figure watching from the edge of the forest. I never went back. Henry stayed, but I heard from the locals that he became even more reclusive after I left. Sometimes I wonder if he ever found the man in the woods, or if he's still out there, waiting for his next opportunity. Either way, I know one thing for sure. I'll never feel safe in the woods again. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine needles, with the heavy clouds above promising rain soon. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to a friend of a friend who had lent it to me for a weekend escape. Tucked away in a tiny village near the United States-Mexico border, it was supposed to be the perfect place to disconnect. No cell service, no distractions, just me and a chance to clear my head. The place wasn't fancy. A one-room setup with a small kitchenette, a wood stove in the corner, and a bed pushed up against the far wall. The windows were large but had thick curtains that I planned on keeping drawn. There was a tiny bathroom off to the side, and the walls were lined with old wooden paneling that creaked whenever I moved. It felt cozy, in a way, but there was something about the silence that made me uneasy. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of quiet that pressed down on you, making you notice every sound your body made, every shuffle of your feet. By the time I'd unloaded my bag and locked the door, the rain had started. It wasn't a drizzle. It came down hard, pattering against the roof and windows like 1,000 tiny hammers. I lit a fire in the wood stove, the crackle of the flames cutting through the steady hum of the storm. The light flickered across the room, throwing long shadows onto the walls. I tried to relax, making myself a quick dinner from the canned food I'd brought. As I ate, I kept looking out the window, even though the curtains were closed. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I told myself it was just my nerves. Being alone in an unfamiliar place, especially one so isolated, would make anyone jumpy. By nightfall, the rain had only gotten worse. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the temperature dropped enough that I had to throw on a sweatshirt and sit closer to the stove. I tried reading, but my eyes kept drifting toward the windows, and eventually, I gave up. Instead, I just sat there, listening to the storm and trying to convince myself that I wasn't scared. Around midnight, I heard it, a loud, sharp knock on the door. My heart froze. Who would be out here in this weather? I didn't move at first, just stared at the door, hoping I'd imagined it. Then it came again, louder this time. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body tense. The door had no peephole, and the windows were too far away to give me a view of whoever or whatever was outside. I approached the door cautiously, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "It's probably nothing," I whispered to myself, though I didn't believe it. As I got closer, I realized how stupid I'd been. I hadn't thought to bring anything for self-defense. No weapon, not even a heavy flashlight. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The knocking stopped, but then I heard footsteps on the porch, the boards creaking under the weight of whoever was out there. I froze, straining my ears. The sound moved toward the side of the cabin, then to the back. My mind raced. Was someone trying to find another way in? The cabin had a back door, but I'd locked it earlier, at least I thought I had. I grabbed the fire poker from the stove, the metal cool and heavy in my hand. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept toward the back door. The rain drowned out most sounds, but every so often, I thought I heard movement. Feet squelching in the mud, something brushing against the walls. At the back door, I stopped and listened. Nothing, just the storm. I checked the lock, it was secure. I exhaled, a small wave of relief washing over me. Maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog. Maybe the sound of shattering glass cut through the night. I whipped around, heart pounding, and saw the broken window on the far side of the cabin. The curtains flapped in the wind, rain spraying inside. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, the fire poker suddenly feeling inadequate. I didn't know what to do. Call for help? There was no cell service, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Run outside? Whoever or whatever was out there could be waiting for me. My only option was to stay put and hope the intruder didn't come inside. But they did. I heard the crunch of boots on broken glass, then slow, deliberate footsteps. The firelight cast long shadows on the walls, and I caught a glimpse of movement near the window. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the knife so tightly my hands ached. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they were in no hurry. I held my breath, my chest tight with fear. The intruder stopped in the middle of the room, just out of my line of sight. I could hear them breathing low and steady, and then they spoke. Not to me, but to someone else. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was calm, almost casual. A second voice responded, deeper, quieter. My stomach dropped. There wasn't just one person, there were at least two. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. My mind raced through my options. Fight? Hide? Wait for them to leave? None of them seemed like good choices. Before I could decide, one of them moved closer, their shadow stretching across the wall. I tightened my grip on the knife, ready to strike if they came any closer. But then they stopped, turning their head as if listening for something. And then they left. Just like that, they were gone. I heard their footsteps retreating, the sound of the door creaking open and slamming shut. I stayed where I was, frozen for what felt like hours. Finally, I forced myself to move, my legs shaky and weak. I peeked out the broken window but saw nothing, just rain and darkness. The rest of the night was a blur. I didn't sleep, didn't move from my spot near the stove. When morning came, I packed my things and left without looking back. Later, I found out that a group of criminals had been using abandoned cabins in the area as hideouts. They must have thought this one was empty. I was lucky, luckier than I had any right to be. Even now, years later, I can still hear the sound of their voices, the slow crunch of their boots on the floor. It's a sound that haunts me, a reminder of just how close I came to disappearing without a trace. The cabin had stood untouched for decades, hidden deep in the forested countryside of southern France. I had rented it on a whim after seeing a post about authentic rustic stays online. The pictures showed weathered stone walls, heavy wooden beams, and an ancient charm that spoke of a simpler time. I was promised isolation, peace, and a true escape from modern life. After a chaotic year in Paris, it seemed like the perfect getaway. I arrived on a cool September afternoon, the sun low and golden. The gravel road leading to the cabin was rough and overgrown, more suited for a tractor than the small rental car I had managed to scrape together. Branches scraped against the car's windows as I inched forward, the cabin finally coming into view after what felt like hours. It was smaller than I expected, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and moss covering the roof. The shutters hung at odd angles, and the front door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I parked the car and stepped out, the silence of the place immediately striking me. No hum of distant highways, no voices, no airplanes overhead. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, before grabbing my bag from the trunk. The key had been left under a loose stone near the door, as per the instructions. It took some force to get the door open. The wood had swelled with years of moisture. Inside, it smelled like mildew and old wood. The furniture was sparse and ancient, A single bed with a sagging mattress, a wooden table with mismatched chairs, and a small stone fireplace. A thick layer of dust coated everything. Felt like stepping back in time. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning. There was no electricity, just an old gas lamp and a wood-burning stove for cooking. The nearest village was miles away, and I had packed enough supplies to last a week. I lit the lamp as the sun dipped below the horizon, the orange glow casting long shadows on the walls. I cooked a simple meal on the stove and ate in silence, the cabin eerily quiet around me. That first night, I struggled to sleep. The mattress was lumpy, and the blankets smelled musty despite my best efforts to air them out. The silence, which had seemed so peaceful during the day, now felt oppressive. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. I eventually drifted off, but my dreams were restless, filled with dark woods and the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense and unwelcoming, but I was determined to make the most of my time there. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and set out, following a faint trail that led away from the cabin. The trees were ancient, their twisted roots and gnarled branches creating an almost claustrophobic atmosphere. The ground was uneven, covered in a thick layer of leaves and moss. After an hour of walking, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an old stone well, its wooden cover rotting and half collapsed. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Curious, I peered inside, but it was too dark to see anything. The air around the well felt colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia and continued my walk, but I couldn't get the image of the well out of my mind. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky. I spent the evening reading by the light of the gas lamp, trying to ignore the growing unease that had settled over me. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I was used to the constant noise and activity of the city, and this silence was something my brain wasn't accustomed to. By the third day, strange things began to happen. It started small. A chair that seemed slightly out of place. A door that was open when I was sure I had closed it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had been careless, or perhaps the uneven floor caused things to shift. But as the days went on, the incidents became harder to explain. My flashlight, which I had left on the table, was missing. I found it hours later, outside by the well. The food I had stored in the cabinet was scattered across the floor when I woke up one morning, though the door to the cabin was still locked. I began to feel like I wasn't alone. At night, I heard faint sounds outside, footsteps, the crunch of leaves, and once, a low murmur that could have been the wind but didn't quite sound like it. I stopped leaving the cabin after dark, barricading the door with the heavy table and keeping the gas lamp burning all night. On the fifth day, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things and loaded them into the car, ready to leave before the sun set. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery, the fuel, everything I could think of, but nothing worked. I was stranded. That night was the worst. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sense of unease grew into outright fear. The sounds outside were louder now, distinct footsteps circling the cabin, the scrape of something against the walls. I stayed awake, clutching the small kitchen knife I had brought with me, my heart racing with every noise. Around midnight, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Then the doorknob rattled, slowly at first, then violently as if someone or something was trying to force it open. I held my breath, gripping the knife tighter, praying the barricade would hold. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time. I grabbed my bag, left the rest of my belongings behind, and started walking. I didn't care where I ended up. I just needed to get away from that cabin. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. I finally reached the main road hours later, exhausted and terrified. A passing car stopped, and the driver, a kind-looking older man, offered me a ride to the nearest village. I didn't tell him much, just that my car had broken down and I needed help. He seemed to sense my fear but didn't press me for details. I never found out what was in that forest, what had been circling the cabin, or why I had been targeted. When I returned with a mechanic days later, the cabin was empty, my belongings untouched. The car started without any issues, as if nothing had ever been wrong. I sold the car as soon as I got back to Paris and swore off rural vacations forever. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that cabin. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the sound of footsteps circling in the dark. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from city life and explore the depths of the Amazon. It was 2012 and I had just left a high-stress corporate job. I needed solitude and a chance to reconnect with nature. A friend of mine who worked in ecotourism suggested I rent a cabin deep in the Peruvian Amazon. He assured me it was remote, safe, and perfect for someone looking to escape the world. The idea thrilled me. I pictured mornings spent sipping coffee while watching the rainforest come alive and evenings with nothing but the sound of insects and distant howls. What I didn't know was how unprepared I was for the realities of living so far from civilization. The cabin was simple but sturdy, built on raised stilts to keep out flooding and jungle creatures. It had a small kitchen, a bedroom with a mosquito net over the bed, and an open-air porch that overlooked the river. There was no electricity, only a solar-powered lantern and a portable gas stove. My supplies included canned food, rice, beans, and a water filter. The cabin's only connection to the outside world was a radio that supposedly worked well enough to call for help if needed. I arrived by boat. The driver, an older local man who didn't speak much English, dropped me off with a nod and a wave. Then he disappeared down the river, leaving me alone. The silence was overwhelming at first, broken only by the hum of insects and the occasional splash of water. I unpacked, set up my little kitchen, and settled into what I hoped would be a peaceful retreat. The first few days were exactly as I imagined. I woke to the calls of howler monkeys and watched colorful birds dart between the trees. I spent hours exploring the area around the cabin, careful not to wander too far. The rainforest was both beautiful and intimidating. The thick vegetation seemed alive, constantly moving and whispering with unseen creatures. On the fourth day, I decided to follow the riverbank further than I had before. I carried a machete to clear any overgrown paths and a small pack with water and snacks. The air was hot and heavy, and every step felt like a chore. I soon regretted not bringing my compass or marking my path because the dense jungle quickly swallowed any signs of the way back. I wasn't lost yet, but the feeling of disorientation was unsettling. I turned around and started retracing my steps, but something felt off. The jungle seemed quieter than usual. The birds had stopped chirping, and even the ever-present hum of insects had faded. It was an unnatural silence, the kind that makes your instincts scream that something is wrong. Then I saw the footprint. It was on a patch of soft mud near the riverbank, and it wasn't mine. It was fresh, too fresh, and larger than any human footprint should be. My heart raced as I crouched to examine it. It was barefoot, the toes long and splayed. It looked human, but off. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a large primate, but the rational part of me knew better. I hurried back to the cabin, adrenaline pushing me through the thick undergrowth. By the time I reached the porch, I was drenched in sweat and shaking. I locked the door, a pointless gesture given the flimsy wooden latch, and sat by the window, staring at the jungle. That night, I barely slept. The rainforest came alive with its usual symphony of sounds, but every rustle and crackle felt amplified. I told myself I was being paranoid. The footprint was probably from a local hunter or a guide, someone passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. The next morning, I found more footprints near the cabin. They circled the perimeter, some close enough to the porch that I could see the faint imprint of toes in the dirt. Whoever or whatever it was had come very close during the night. I checked the radio, but it was dead. I hadn't charged it properly. I cursed myself for being so careless. I spent the day barricading the cabin as best I could. I pushed the small table and chairs against the door and propped my heavy backpack against the windows. I kept the machete close and cooked a simple meal of rice and beans, though I had no appetite. The isolation that had seemed so appealing now felt like a trap. That night, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. They circled the cabin, pausing near the windows and the door. I held my breath, clutching the machete, and listened. Whoever it was didn't try to get inside, but they wanted me to know they were there. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours before fading into the jungle. By morning, the footprints were back. This time, they were joined by something else, handprints, smudged and smeared along the porch railing. They were too large to be human. I felt a rising panic, but forced myself to stay calm. I had to leave. I couldn't survive out here with whatever was stalking me. Packing was quick. I grabbed only the essentials: food, water, the machete, and the dead radio, hoping I could find a place to charge it. I decided to follow the river downstream, figuring it would eventually lead to a village or at least a main waterway. The trek was grueling. The jungle seemed to close in around me, and every sound made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I was being followed. I was right. As the sun began to set, I saw movement in the trees. Shadows darted between the trunks, too fast to be animals. I picked up my pace, stumbling over roots and pushing through thorny bushes. My heart pounded as I caught glimpses of figures, tall, lanky, and not quite human. Night fell, and I had no choice but to stop. I found a spot near the river where I could see in all directions and built a small fire. It felt like a weak barrier against whatever was out there. The shadows stayed at the edge of the firelight, watching. I could feel their eyes on me, unblinking and predatory. I didn't sleep. At first light, I continued downstream, exhausted and terrified. The shadows followed, always just out of sight. My mind raced with questions. What were they? Why were they stalking me? But the jungle offered no answers, only more fear. On the third day of running, I saw a boat. It was small, with a single motor, tied to a tree near the riverbank. Relief flooded me as I stumbled toward it. I didn't care who it belonged to. I just needed to escape. I untied the boat and started the motor, glancing back at the jungle one last time. The shadows stood at the edge of the trees, watching as I sped away. They didn't follow, but their presence lingered in my mind. It took hours to reach a village. I stumbled onto the shore, babbling incoherently about shadows and footprints. The locals stared at me, their faces a mix of pity and disbelief. They didn't understand my language, and I didn't care. I was alive. I never found out what those figures were. Locals spoke of isolated tribes and strange creatures, but nothing matched what I had seen. The Amazon had secrets, and I had barely survived one of them. To this day, I can't hear the sound of rustling leaves without feeling that cold, watching presence again.